Buonasera, buonasera a tutti, benvenuti. Welcome to Casa Italiana Zerilli-marimò of New York University. We are delighted to host this event, Dreaming of the USA, the Writings and Translations of Cesare Pavese. Cesare Pavese is one of the most important contemporary authors, a monument of Italian literature after World War II, considered one of the founders of Italian literary neorealism. And we are paying homage to him tonight to celebrate a series of researches that the Fondazione Pavese commissioned to a young scholar who happens to be here in New York, Yuri Muscardi. We'll talk a lot about that. But for us, it's also an homage to Cesare Pavese and to his life and love for America, a country that he never visited as much as he would have liked, but that he carried in his heart. And it was a troubled heart of a communist who loved America. He was not alone in that. It was quite common. There was this ideological association with the Communist Party and at the same time this attraction to America. And Pavese's relationship with America is very complex, very interesting, and it's on different levels. One, of course, is the fact that he translated some of the major American authors into Italian. And he ended up absorbing some of the syntax, the style, the tone of these authors, radically changing the literary language of Italy at that time, not only his own, but also the language of others. So going miles away from the D'Annunzian prose that was considered to be the good one, very complex, elaborated with a lot of subordinations, and reaching a different style that is very reminiscent of the prose of the American English of the beginning of the 20th century. And then through the translations, he made these authors known in Italy and loved. And also there was this desire, as we mentioned, to come to America and to experience it. He never did. And for us, this evening is also a way to bring, ideally, Pavese to America, for him to realize and for us to realize also the importance that he has had here in this country that he had never visited during his life. We have a very full evening. So we have 3 speakers that are going to present different. First is Yuri, and then other 2 speakers that I'm delighted to welcome at the Casa tonight. And then after that, there is going to be a sort of ceremony because the Fondazione Pavese will award its award to an excellent scholar who is here with us. At the end, she will also deliver her remarks. And that's going to be the evening. So the 3 speakers, the award ceremony, and then the winner of the Cesare Pavese, Fondazione Cesare Pavese, will also address us. So it's a packed evening. And without further ado, I would like to ask the co-sponsor of this evening, along with the Fondazione Cesare Pavese and Casa Italiana, there is the Fondazione Ragusa next door. You might have seen where the Italian bookstore used to be, SF Vanni. The bookstore belonged to the 2 Ragusa sisters that decided to create this foundation exactly for the study of Italian literature and culture, but in an international context. And the president of the Fondazione Ragusa is here with us tonight, and he's going to introduce our speakers. Please welcome Andrea Ciccarelli.
I have to thank, of course, Director Albertini, Professor Albertini, Stefano, because of his kindness and the collaborations that we have. And of course, I would like to thank Yuri Muscardi for this wonderful idea and the Fondazione Cesare Pavese and everybody who is here. I will briefly introduce the speakers because it's a long evening. The first speaker tonight is Yuri Muscardi. Yuri Muscardi is a PhD. First of all, he was a student of mine, so. But beside that, and I know that from other students that he was very good in making my accents and in teasing me. He's a very good imitator, voice imitator. I never heard him, but people told me that he's very good about that. So now, after so many years, I can tell him that I know what you did at the end of class. Okay. So Yuri Muscardi is a PhD candidate in comparative literature at the Graduate Center here in New York at the CUNY. He graduated in Italian literature from the Università degli Studi di Milano, studying Cesare Pavese, and obtained a Master of Arts at Indiana University. Since 2012, he took part in the digital social reading experiments of TWI Letteratura and BTWIL, TW as in Twitter, in other words, now at the center of his dissertation. He edited the collection of essays Cesare Pavese, mythographer, translator, modernist, that came out in 2023, very recently, and the first complete English translation of Pavese's diary, Il mestiere di vivere, which is forthcoming. And today, one of his articles on Pavese just came out on Italica, the journal of the Association of Italian of Teachers of Italian. In fact, it's the number 100 of Italica, 100 years old and number 100. So congratulations to Yuri. Tonight, Yuri will talk about new discoveries on Pavese's translation. Yuri.
Sorry. What is it? Julian. Sorry. Oh no. Try to go this way. Let's see. Sorry. Okay, here we are. Can you see? I hope. Yeah. I'm very sorry. Okay. Almost done. Exactly. Oh, come on. Finally. Okay. First of all, I would like to thank all of you for being here tonight in person and also online. I would like to express my gratitude to Professor Stefano Albertini and to all the staff of Casa Italiana NYU for their generous hospitality, as well as to the Olga Ragusa Foundation, because Professor Andrea Ciccarelli, the president of the foundation, contributed significantly to the organization of this symposium. Tonight I am presenting for the first time the discoveries I made on the books donated to Fondazione Pavese by the Molina family. This donation is extremely important for the study of Pavese as a translator and, in a broader sense, as an intellectual. We know that translation was a fundamental activity for Pavese. He translated authors first as a source of income and, along all of his life, as a way to satisfy his intellectual curiosity. Among the authors he translated, he considered American writers as the most important. In an article he published in 1947, he defined American culture as qualcosa di molto serio e prezioso, something very serious and extremely serious and precious. Given the significance of translating American authors to Pavese, the book in Fondo Molina provides an extraordinary opportunity to analyze Pavese's approach and methodology in translating them. As this slide shows, all of these books are by British and American authors, and almost all of them contain annotations or other notes left by Pavese on their pages. Also, Pavese translated 3 of them in the 1930s, and which are the one, it's the one underlined, of course. Analyzing these books is like entering in the workshop of the translator. Pavese used them as instrument for his work. All of 3 were published in Italy in the 1930s, between 1933 and 1938, and at that time translating was the main source of income for Pavese. As mentioned earlier, examining the pages of these books enabled us 7 decades later to reconstruct Pavese's work as a translator. As we will see, this analysis confirms what Pavese wrote in 1931 to the publisher Enrico Bemporad. Bemporad published Pavese's first ever translation of an American author, which was Sinclair Lewis' Our Mr. Wren, but was not entirely satisfied by the translator's work. In his answer, Pavese explained the strategy he followed as a translator. Intendere il più fedelmente possibile il testo e rendere quel che sarà inteso non con la laterale equivalenza linguistica, ma col più nostro sforzo di ricreazione possibile. Una traduzione che sia una seconda creazione. In other words, understand the original text and convey it not with linguistic equivalence, but with the most Italian effort to recreation. A translation which is like a second creation. Pavese engaged with these books, the 3 he translated, in different ways according to the different challenges they presented him with. When he translated Joyce's Daedalus, Pavese used the first page, one on the left, as a reminder for him to translate streets and squares in Italiano. Also, we can notice different stages of work. He underlined with a red pencil words and passages that he couldn't understand, and then he struck them out with a pen. We will see that this was the typical process followed by Pavese. A first reading during which he underlined and marked difficult passages, followed by a review of them. We have evidence of this process on page 100, the one on the right over there. Here, Pavese not only underlined the term lots, but he also marked the page on the left margin. In a letter of February-March 1933, Pavese wrote to an unknown person asking for help. He said that, among other difficulties, he could not find the exact translation of a word on page 100, which is exactly this one. Unfortunately, he received not a useful help. Lots is the name of a company read by the protagonist Stephen on a poster, and Pavese chose not to translate it. And here's the text of the letter. And this is how Pavese translated. Vide una parola oscena sul muro del vicolo, so no correspondence. On another page, Pavese strongly underlined and marked the page in the margin in correspondence with the lullaby taken from a spelling book. He struggled with the two very similar words, canker and cancer, which rhyme in English. Because he couldn't find corresponding rhyming words in Italian, Pavese chose to retain them in English and added a footnote for explanation, as you can see there. Il canker è una malattia delle piante e il cancer degli animali. E in the footnote, il canker è il bruco e il cancer è il cancro. He was also helped by having found the same passage a few pages later in the book. Pavese also wrote on the pages. It seems to do so as a help for himself when translating some difficult sentences. For instance, he did so in translating the expression, "That's the real Ellie Deli," an expression used in the 19th century for extremely high-quality food in comparison with the food cooked by Ellie's Deli. With this note, Pavese inserted the passage to help him. As you can see, is struck out later per mostrare com'era, and very similar in the translation. Prendete questo, signore, è quel che ci vuole. The same happened with the word scat, underlined with the red pencil, and as you can see on the right, at the bottom of the page, Pavese tried an intermediate translation with sono scappati, but the very last translation is perché l'han tagliata, much more colloquial. Let's focus now on the other books that Pavese translated, which is Gertrude Stein's autobiography of Alice Toklas. In this book, Pavese continued his rigorous practice of underlining difficult words and passages. Also, as shown in these 2 pages, he helped himself by emphasizing connection between identical passages which he found in different pages. Here it is to find the correct spelling of this name, Faye. As it happened with Joyce, Pavese occasionally wrote a translation of passages on the page. Here, for instance, we have on the left a translation for "get under their skins," and Pavese also some remarks for himself, like in this curious self-reference on the right page, in which he wrote "Qui comincio a usare garbato per gentle." Finally, we can find another reference to Pavese's methodology when he mentioned the page number of a typescript. Here is here on the left, DATT, dattilo scritto. This kind of annotation is in Dickens also, and it is referred to the last step of his translation process. A final review comparing the original text and the typescript to be used for printing the Italian text. Let's now focus on the third and final book that belonged to Fondo Molina and that Pavese translated, which is Dickens' David Copperfield. The edition that Pavese was translating was made of 3 volumes, and on the frontispiece of the first volume, we can find something like what we have already seen on the first page of Joyce's book. Similar to the previous example, Pavese listed here some rules that he found pertinent for the translations, along with other less understandable suggestions for himself. The clearest one here refers to the churches, whom English names Pavese had to translate into Italian, with this remark, le chiese tradotte. Within the cover of the third volume, Pavese left some pages with manuscript notes that are of fundamental importance for my analysis. On one of these pages, he listed all the pages of the text that he needed to go back for a final review, and on another, the English words he needed to control. As you can see here, pages and words. These pages witness his scrupulous method of working as a translator. As he wrote, Pavese needed first to understand the text if he wanted to convey it in its best Italian recreative effort. A confirmation of this method comes from the word sexton, which is among the ones listed in this list. At page 365 of the second volume, Pavese underlined it with the pen, marking it with a big question mark on the margin. But he was able to find a suitable translation for the word. And as you can see here, is a sacrestano, which is listed there on the right on the list of the words he needed to check. As in the previous two books, translated by him, Pavese maintained his habit of underlining words and to write in the page margins to help himself. This happened when he encountered difficult sentences, whose structure Dickens took from ancient English or from local slang. For instance, Pavese struggled with the expression gormed and to be gormed, which he found on the same page here, and as you can see, underlined and also a sign, vertical sign in the margin. This is a slang expression from the local variants of languages spoken in northern England. It is used for referring to people made, let's say, unable to reason by the abuse of alcohol. Lacking more specific references, Pavese had to translate them figuratively. And as you can see, le terribili bestemmie che potevano creparlo in the first instance, and then in the second one, di questo terribile verbo passivo venir crepato. Very, very figurative way. For the same reason, the text of this lullaby is maintained in English. Oh, sorry, and it is in this slide. It is also worth mentioning a passage that shows a brilliant solution adopted by Pavese, which perfectly illustrates his efforts for a second creation of the translated text. The passage is here and refers specifically like an admiring Robin, and Pavese chose to translate it with come uno Zanni stupefatto. This switch implies an intercultural and literary switch, because the Robin mentioned is Robin Sterveling, one of the characters from Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream, and Robin is one of the most humorous characters in the play. He uses a lantern in a failed attempt to portray moonshine, for example. Being used here as a metonymy, Pavese had to find a similar literary character to maintain this comparison. And he chose Zanni, which is one of the traditional masks in the Italian commedia dell'arte, known for its astuteness and trickster qualities. The much more famous Harlequin is nothing more than a very good example of Zanni. In this way, Pavese was able to maintain the reference to the trickster, a humorous character. And moreover, the reference to Zanni, compared to the one to Robin, was more understandable for Italian readers. So I focused for my analysis on the three books that Pavese translated, and as I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, analyzing their pages allows us to enter Pavese's translation workshop, one of the many mestieri jobs that he pursued during his life. Through the various signs and notes that he left behind, we can reconstruct the process he followed, which consisted of different phases. During the initial reading, Pavese underlined words and sentences that he felt needed double-checking. As we have seen, this first phase of his process might have different characteristics. sentences underlined with a pencil or with a red pencil, with or without the marks on the page, emphasizing the relevance. Additionally, sometimes the second phase of his translation process left its mark on these words, when Pavese crossed them out with a pen or a pencil. Simultaneously, the second phase was characterized by Pavese's attempts to translate single words or sentences in the margins of the pages. The final step of the process involved preparing a typescript for the book's printing, allowing Pavese to perform a final review on the text by comparing the translated version with the original. The three books Pavese translated are very different. They were written and published in at different times and belong to various literary trends and conventions. Most importantly, the three authors were very different. For these reasons, Pavese had to face different challenges. With Joyce, he had to find the best ways to convey his unconventional use of the English language. Although not as extreme as in Finnegan's Wake, Joyce employed childhood language with lullabies or puns that were sometimes difficult to translate. On the contrary, with Stein, he had to convey the apparently superficial simplicity of a text, imagined as the fake autobiography of a real person. Finally, with Dickens, he had to face the challenge of ancient terms, often drawn from slangs or other jargons. The analysis of how Pavese translated these books also allows us to better understand how challenging this work must have been for him in the 1930s. Pavese undertook these endeavors mainly for intellectual purposes. Back in those days, and even today, translating was indeed a very poorly paid job. However, after discovering these authors who represented to him a new idea of literature and consequently another kind of society, he felt it necessary to introduce them to Italian readers. Pavese always defined himself as impolitico, apolitical, not interested in politics. Nevertheless, these efforts are examples of a clear, well-defined cultural agenda. Translating these authors represented for him the attempt to show Italians that, despite the oppression of the fascist regime, an alternative for a better society was still possible. Thanks to the books donated by the Molina family to the Fondazione Pavese, we now have the opportunity to discover how Pavese approached, read, and translated them. And most importantly tonight, we can finally fulfill one of Pavese's biggest dreams, visiting the United States. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Yuri, for this wonderful presentation. The second speaker tonight is Brian Robert Moore. Brian Robert Moore is a translator. His translation from the Italian include A Silence Shared by Lalla Romano, Meeting in Positano by Goliarda Sapienza, and You Bleeding Childhood and Verdigris by Michele Mari. His writing and his translation are appeared in Lit Hub, The New Yorker, The Nation, and in other journals, and he has received many fellowships and awards from the National Endowment for the Arts, PEN American, English PEN, and the Santa Maddalena Foundation. Tonight, Brian Robert Moore will talk about Running into Cesare Pavese, Legacies of Translations.
Okay, I don't know if I'll be able to find. Yes, thank you. And anyway, in the meantime, thank you, Casa Italiana and Ragusa Foundation, Yuri, of course, Fondazione Cesare Pavese, for asking me to be here. I'm going to start with a quick anecdote about Pavese and American literature from the author, a contemporary of his, Lalla Romano. Hemingway was in Italy. Einaudi wanted to send Pavese to meet him, but he didn't want to go. Calvino and Natalia Ginsburg went. Pavese told the story with great amusement. They went into the lion's den, and he added, if Hemingway wants to know me, he can come here, which in Italian was, se Hemingway mi vuole conoscere, venga qui. Today I'm going to speak a bit about Pavese's enduring legacy, not so much as a writer, but as a translator, and in general as an editor and fosterer of translations. Personally, Pavese was one of my first loves in terms of Italian literature, but I think it's just as important to give testimony to his kind of wide-reaching importance, to also talk about his presence in the writers and the translators that came after him, even when one is not necessarily looking for him. Since Pavese was so invested in giving voice to Anglophone writers in Italian, I was asked to essentially speak about the reverse dynamic and about my own experience trying to give voice to Italian writers in English. And over the past few years, in fact, while I've been trying to essentially bring these Italian authors to America, I found and again that I had to work back through Pavese. In other words, in order to fully know what I was translating, I had to go to him, or as he might have said, venga qui da me. This has been the case for two extremely important authors who were writing in very different time periods and are stylistically worlds apart. The first of whom is Michele Mari, who's a contemporary author. Mari is really well known in Italy, especially for his use of, let's say, literary pastiche, or as he terms it, a literary vampirism, by which he mimetically recreates older styles and literary voices. Unsurprisingly, when American literature is involved, we can again and again notice traces of Pavese in his work. A key example of this mimetic approach in Mari's body of work is a short story called Otto Scrittori, or Eight Writers, which has become a bit of a classic in its own right, and which appears in my translation of You Bleeding Childhood, originally Tu Sanguinosa Infanzia. In the story, a young Mari, who's an avid reader of maritime adventure fiction, including novels by Melville, Stevenson, Defoe, etc., decides he must ultimately decide which of his 8 favorite writers are the greatest in terms of the genre of adventure fiction. So it's a bit of a spoiler, but it might not come as a huge surprise that the writer of Moby Dick is ultimately victorious and is chosen as the greatest. So interwoven throughout the text are the voices of these various authors, and Melville in particular. But what I gradually realized when translating this story was that it wasn't really imbued with Melville's voice per se, but with Pavese's translation of Moby Dick. And for me, this was really a concrete glimpse into how the voice that a translator gives to a book and to specific characters in the target language can endure in time. I mean, well beyond the book itself even. So sometimes these references to Pavese's translation or Moby Dick they appear without quotation marks and are so essentially hidden in the text. And this is one example when the character of Ahab is first introduced in Mari's story. So I realized through research and pure chance that this was essentially a straight quotation of Pavese's translation of Moby Dick, with 2 words skipped. Other than that, it's an exact quote. And this is a description in the original that would be that Ahab looks like, quote, a man cut away from the stake when the fire has overrunningly wasted all the limbs without consuming them. Further on in the story, even though Pavese is never actually named, these references become explicit. For instance, there's one passage quoted at length when the young Mari ultimately, he's thinking about the duel that is going to take place between Stevenson and Melville, and then he realizes that there's really no competition at all, because one passage cited from Moby Dick is enough to essentially show its superiority. It's funny because this same passage is actually one of the 2 passages that Pavese himself quotes in his initial essay on Moby Dick. So it might not be a total coincidence. In introducing that passage, Pavese writes, and this is in Edwin Fussel's translation, to show the whole construction of this work would require a page-by-page commentary for all the 600 pages of the book, nor could one otherwise exhaust the wealth of techniques and effects in Moby Dick. Here I can only give 2 diverse excerpts in order to illustrate what I have said, end quote. So again, I really don't think it's a coincidence that Mari goes to this passage, especially when using Pavese's translation. What I find striking in this section of the translation, as throughout the translation of Moby Dick, I won't read it because it's a bit long, but it's essentially its propulsive rhythm, which is really great at capturing the original. In fact, in Pavese's diary, he said that Moby Dick is not characters, but it's pure rhythm. And this quality, I think, you can see how it comes in importance, I mean, for the translator before other stylistic qualities, including the actual distinctiveness of some of these characters and their voices. So while Pavese's translation is obviously overall a tremendous feat, it's somewhat ironic in a way that it has become more than any other translation of his of American literature, a classic in its own right in Italy. And I think this is ironic because, to me, it actually is the greatest divergence from what he himself originally appreciated the most about American literature. And here I'll quote, and this is a translation by Lawrence Smith, quote, "As slang is the living part of all languages, English has become American by it. My conclusion is then that there are not a slang and a classic language, but there is an American language formed by a perfectly fused mixture of both." So Pavese was obsessed with the living vitality of American slang, which, of course, as Yuri was also mentioning, it was a big influence on how he wrote his own novels, opting for a universal Italian, but in a way that still felt local, even regional, often through syntax. But in Moby Dick, again, there is not just, quote, the living man who narrates as he feels with balance and vitality, as Pavese wrote admiringly of Sherwood Anderson. There is also the imbalance and the archaic, we could even say dead language of many of its characters, Ahab and the other Quakers especially. And this is a language that was already distinctly unmodern and dated when Melville was writing. So that's a kind of difference between, say, working on a text by Dickens. Pavese wrote that, quote, "To translate Moby Dick is to put yourself in touch with the times." And he might have valued what he saw as contemporary over what was intentionally archaic in the text, potentially. So in particular, while it's understandable that Pavese couldn't use any direct substitute for the antiquated pronouns and conjugations used by characters like Ahab, I'm not sure he always infuses the text with other older, more dated elements to make up for their loss. So let's just look at a quick line from Ahab from a very famous scene. He says, "But what's this long face about, Mr. Starbuck? Wilt thou not chase the white whale? Art not game for Moby Dick?" Which in Pavese's translation ends with, "Non la darai tu la caccia alla balena bianca? Non te la senti d'incontrare Moby Dick?" For an Italian speaker, I'd say it's pretty easy to see how once the archaic second person is lost, the jumble of old and modern shifts in favor of the latter, and the translation feels a bit more current than the original. So this Ahab, who translated literally back into English, might say something like, "What, you don't feel like meeting Moby Dick?" He could exist in the Manhattan or on the ranches of Pavese's other 20th century translations, but he doesn't really seem infused with a 17th century text like the King James Bible. And there are a number of reasons why this is, which I can't really go into, but of course the histories of the Bible in the different languages being very different. But the point really is what I found in translating Mari's riffing on Melville back into English was that it was so inspired by the 20th century sensibilities of Pavese that in order to be recognizable for an American reader, it actually had to be brought further back in time, as it were, in comparison to the original. Just to give a quick line from Mari's story, Ahab says, "Un'idea pazzesca, mi chiedo come possa esservi saltata in mente," which then becomes, in my translation, "'Tis a mad idea, I wonder how it hath sprung into thy head." So I wanted to speak a bit about a very particular detail to show how Mari's references to American culture really are a huge influence on Mari, but beyond Moby Dick, you can notice them throughout his body of work, both in terms of high and low culture. So while another favorite of Mari's is Of Mice and Men, which he himself would retranslate later in his career, and which was a very important influence for another novel, Verdigris, which I translated, which is coming out in January. Once again, at the beginning of You Bleeding Childhood, Mari waxes poetic about childhood comics, in particular Mickey Mouse magazine or Topolino, and especially its epic and classical reiterations titled Topolineide and Paperepopeia, which I called Mickineid and Donald Duckisy to get the joke across. It's believed with relative certainty that the first edition of Le Avventure di Topolino was, of course, translated by Cesare Pavese. And I just would say that I think it seems fitting that Mickey Mouse in Italian would go on to have this Greek and Roman mythic epic scope, considering the role that Pavese played in bringing Mickey Mouse into English originally. So after Mari, I'll switch gears a bit to talk about Pavese as an editor and as a foster of translations in general in relation to a different author, Lalla Romano, who was a contemporary, a friend of Pavese's originally from the University of Turin. After she graduated, she began a career as a painter and published her first collection of poetry, Fiore, in 1941. But again, Pavese had the biggest influence on Romano, the writer, in his role as an editor of translations for Einaudi Editore. As she would write herself, quote, "It was Pavese during the war who proposed to me the translation of Trois Contes, that is, Flaubert's Three Tales. Who can say why me exactly? Pavese had greatly appreciated my little book of poems, Fiore, and regretted that Einaudi couldn't publish it. Do you want to translate Flaubert's Three Tales? He had his usual air about him, ironic, but also a bit severe." Romano wasn't actually the only one who was surprised that Pavese had chosen her to translate Flaubert, seeing as she had never translated anything before. A letter from December 1942 to another Einaudi editor, Carlo Muscetta, proves that Pavese actually had to reassure others of his choice. As he wrote, "It seems you were complaining about the assignment we made for Trois Contes. The translator is the author of Fiore, Lalla Romano, a woman of letters." So in fact, Romano's background, her literary background, but especially her sensibilities as a poet, were enough for Pavese to justify the choice as a translator. And what followed was an experience that Lalla Romano, about which she wrote, quote, "I can say that it changed my life. The translation of this simple and essential prose allowed me to realize that prose can be just as rigorous as poetry, that prose and poetry are rather the same thing. Flaubert's A Simple Heart was decisive for me, the end of the prejudice I had against the novel," end quote. So from her experience as a translator, Lalla Romano, the prose writer and novelist, was born. Things really came full circle when she would write her first book length of prose immediately after the war, a collection of dreams titled Le Metamorfosi. Then Pavese played a direct role in getting Einaudi to publish it, and it came out in 1951 in the Gettoni series, which was curated by another great Americanist, Elio Vittorini. On the same card, Natalia Ginsburg and Pavese wrote to Romano after reading the manuscript. "I find it very beautiful, fecund, vivifying," wrote Ginsburg, under which Pavese wrote, "I agree, I'll try not to let myself be fecundated." He then goes on to assure Romano that they would try to convince the publisher, Einaudi. Romano commemorated the experience translating Flaubert after being commissioned by Pavese in a novel published in 1957, Tetto Murato, which I translated as A Silence Shared. It's a key autobiographical detail in the book, As Romano writes in the very first chapter, I had work to do in those weeks, a classic to translate. I sank into it like something that was outside of time, which calmed me. In the novel, Giulia, who's a version of Romano herself, who's living in isolation in her hometown of Cuneo during the war, develops a deep relationship with a couple in the surrounding countryside, Ada and Paolo, a partisan who has gone into hiding due to a mysterious illness. The real-life Ada and Paolo were actually named Eugenia and Adolfo Ruata, and they are the same couple that Pavese turned into Clelia and Doro in his novel La Spiaggia, or The Beach. As Giulia spends the final winter of the war with the couple, they slip into a dreamlike, almost fairy tale atmosphere, one that again feels outside of time. It's striking that Romano directly makes the connection to a world outside of time in direct reference to this translation commissioned by Pavese. As she would later write about her novel, quote, "War is a form of peace," Pavese said, and he meant the suspension of regular life, the suspension of regular norms, and in that void, another norm, another life in which everyone gives the best or the worst of themselves. As Romano's characters enter into this suspension of norms and this time outside of time, they seem to return to a certain extent to a fabled, far-off realm of childhood. Pavese, of course, was fond of using the term outside of time or fuori del tempo when writing about myth or the mythic fable, which he similarly called una norma, and about its connection to childhood, as we can see in Feria d'Agosto. Pavese wrote, especially in the second passage, that every time we are moved or happy, it was because we were moved or happy already once before in a forgotten part of childhood. Though her style and her approach are very different, throughout A Silence Shared, Romano seems to be pointing to these buried and irretrievable moments of childhood. For instance, when Giulia is at the dinner table at the couple's hideaway, she says, "I felt happy and at the same time melancholy, as if the current joy were the resurfacing of another forgotten happiness." So the novel is really full of moments like these, and the characters themselves, in a way, in a very nuanced way, return to their childhood selves. It seems almost fated for these reasons that the novel went on to win the inaugural Pavese Prize in 1956, with a jury that consisted of writers such as Italo Calvino and Carlo Levi. The jury said that the geographic and thematic similarities between the authors had, quote, "by a happy coincidence made it so that the first edition of the Premio Pavese fully achieves its goal of perpetuating the spirit of our great writer's body of work." That author being Pavese, of course. The original title of Romano's novel is Tetto Murato, which is actually a place name. It's where they're staying and hiding, because Tetto is a group of farmhouses in local usage. Upon receiving the prize, Romano explained, quote, "I knew that name, and once in Turin, someone said it to Pavese. We were in the house of mutual friends. Pavese said, 'What a title for a novel.' Maybe precisely in that moment, from that name, from the sense of mystery, of isolation that emanates from it, the idea for my novel was born," end quote. Now, seeing as murato literally means bricked up or walled in, this sense of isolation that Pavese was commenting on relies on a play on words that's lost in English. But Pavese, his presence itself, is not lost here, because the English translation of the novel takes the title from the epigraph, which is a line from Pavese's dialogues with Leucot. "The only true silence is a silence shared." On the relevance of this line of Pavese's for her novel, Romano wrote, quote, "Solitary silence is mute because it is in fact solitude, and soliloquy can become a confession, but not a novel. Shared implies the other, which can be, as is the case here, a community," end quote. So this dichotomy between soliloquy and community, and the necessity of breaking out of isolation to form community and to foster communication, are again elements Romano noted in Pavese's work. In her review of his Prima che il gallo canti, she describes how, quote, a taciturn man like Corrado decides to speak to us because his isn't a soliloquy of Narcissus, but a conversation with us. And it's right that, in the end, Corrado is not ashamed, like Pavese's Melville, of being what he is, end quote. It was a review that Pavese particularly appreciated, not least of all for its references to his other books and translations. He wrote to Romano in April 1941, while I was reading it, I said, this Pavese guy is really likable. I need to read him entirely and in depth, which is an opinion I think all of us share, and so I'll end on that note. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Brian, for this very lively presentation. And we now know that Pavese translated the first Mickey Mouse into Italian, which is something we didn't know. At least I didn't. The next speaker is Jhumpa Lahiri. Jhumpa Lahiri, of course, is one of the most known writers in the world, in Italian and in English. She's currently the Millicent McIntosh Professor of English and Director of the Creative Writing Program at Barnard College. She is the author of many short story collections, Interpreter Maladies and Accustomed Earth, novels like The Namesake and The Lowland, as well as in Italian, In altre parole, Il vestito dei libri, Dove mi trovo, and a volume of poetry, Il quaderno di Nerina, and in a few weeks, I think, the English version of Racconti Romani will come out with Roman Tales, the title, Roman Stories, which is her last work in Italian and in English. She has translated novels by Domenico Starnone. She has received many awards, including, of course, the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction, a Guggenheim Fellowship, and many other awards. She is currently also translating Ovid's Metamorphoses from Latin into English with Jelena Barretz from Princeton University. Tonight, Professor Lahiri will talk about Through Me Forbidden Voices, the influence of Whitman and Melville on the linguistic voyage of Cesare Pavese.
Good evening, buonasera a tutte e tutti. It's so lovely to be back at the casa after a long time. Thank you, Stefano, sempre for your hospitality, and to Andrea and Yuri and Brian. I've so enjoyed these presentations and thinking about, on a really granular level, Pavese's process as a translator in particular. And I too will focus a bit on that. I don't have a formal talk. I don't have slides. I have some books. I will read from them now and then. And I have some notes. And I'll try to be succinct as well. As a writer and as a translator now, as a writer-translator, Pavese has been a point of reference for me for quite some time. I've been thinking about his role as a hybrid literary figure, someone who is was always straddling genre, languages, his many roles as editor, translator, writer, and so forth. And his, I think in particular, his interest, or shall we say his obsession with language. And in recent years, as I've turned from writing in English to Italian and have been asked so very many times, why are you doing this? Why do you do this? What could possibly lead you to do something like this? I wish I could sometimes say, well, look at Cesare Pavese, who has paved the way for me working in the opposite direction. And so he guides me in that way as well. The thing I think I connect most to in Pavese is the fact that he was always going toward the unknown, toward the strange, toward the other, but most of all toward the other in himself. Okay, so this dialogue, fundamental dialogue with himself, with the I, the internal I, that is, not only split in two, but I would say into many parts, and the richness that comes from this inner division of the I of Pavese, and also the anguish. So I'm going to try to focus a little bit on this idea of the known versus the unknown, and the role of ignorance. Okay, ignorance as a sort of generative force, if you will, and also the dangers of ignorance. Of course, we know that ignorance is dangerous, and we try to move toward enlightenment generally as human beings. I would like to think about parts versus the whole as a practice, and also as a theme in Pavese. He tackled so many works as a translator, but the two I want to talk about today, The Song of Myself by Whitman and Moby Dick, the two works he really grappled with at a very young age. So, really as he's leaping off the precipice into what will be the rest of his career, the rest of his creative journey. So I want to talk about this idea of how he confronted works of such enormous scope. And of course, the question, which we've already heard quite a bit about, of translation and interpretation and analysis. So not only speaking on behalf of others, which is in some sense how we can think about a translator, writing, giving voice to another, but also studying another, okay, analyzing, understanding, reading other writers. And finally, this, and already been mentioned, this fundamental key in Pavese, the tension between the classicism and what I would call modernity, okay? And we know that he was very tied to the mythic key, this sort of out of time notion of being out of time, timelessness, but we also know that he chose famously "The ripeness is all" from King Lear, right? As the most iconic of his epigraphs, shall we say. So what I'd like to focus on is a kind of narrow period. And so I'll just read a couple of dates that I think are relevant. So in 1930, Pavese graduates from the University of Torino, and he writes this famous thesis on Walt Whitman. In that same year, his mother dies, and I think this is relevant because he loses his home, and he moves to Torino and lives with his sisters, where he will live. This will be his home base for the rest of his life. So he writes this thesis called The Interpretation of the Poems of Walt Whitman, very basic title. In that same year, he writes his first poem, I Mari del Sud, which I will talk about a little bit in detail. Anyway, so important things happening that year. The following year, he starts to translate, for a living and to teach English. That's the year he actually moves in with his sister. And it's the same year that the translation of Moby Dick is commissioned. And he takes on this colossal project for 1,000 lire. And the following year, it comes out. I mean, just saying, the following year it comes out, so febrile activity, fitting for such a febrile narrative. And then he has makes comments in subsequent years, in 1934, on his poems and the influence of Walt Whitman. He starts commenting more formally on all of this research and thinking he's done on Whitman. And in 1936, this is the last date, so we're really talking about a 6-year period, his first poems, a volume of poems comes out, Lavorare stanca. And that first poem that he writes, I mari del sud, is the first poem in this collection. Okay, so I really want to think about these 6 years and how his understanding, his study of Whitman, and his translation of Moby Dick are how these two activities and spheres of activity and thinking are serving to launch the creative life of this extraordinary writer, among so many other things. So Whitman and Melville, interesting, born the same year, 1819, same year. They die 1 year apart, Whitman in 1892, Melville in 1891. I would suggest thinking of these two figures as sort of the two pillars and two fathers, if you will, of Pavese in terms of his entire opus, okay? They are fascinating to think about together, not only because of their mythic scope, both of them, but because there's this sort of interesting oscillation between the poetic and and prose, right? So these rhythms, these sort of biblical cadences in both works. They're both, of course, based, in New York City, and so they have interesting relationships and thoughts on, country versus urban landscapes, and all of these things are things that Pavese is going to start thinking about, and they are going to start feeding his own work. I was doing some reading on this period in his life, and there's a lot, people say, oh, well, Pavese was studying sort of classical literature as a high school student, this and that, and then he suddenly swerved toward America, the idea of America, American literature, and that this is somehow kind of a bifurcation. And in fact, I would argue against that. In fact, I think Pavese is rooted in the classical always, and I think what he's finding in Whitman and in Melville is classical resonance, mythic resonance. In any case, just a word about this thesis if you don't know. So it's rejected. He writes this thesis at 21 years old. It's rejected initially because it adheres to sort of aesthetic theories of Benedetto Croce. It's controversial under fascism. It's talking about a foreign author, et cetera, et cetera. But the other thing that's really interesting about this thesis is that it's very personal. And he uses the prima persona. He uses I. He says, I think. It seems to me that. This is completely unconventional for an academic thesis even today, but certainly back in 1931 when he's trying to defend his thesis. So it's rejected by Federico Olivero, and there's some, back and forth, and eventually it is accepted by another professor, Ferdinando Neri, and celebrated, et cetera, and it's recently been published. You can find it. It's been edited by Valerio Magrelli, et cetera. So now it's okay, this amazing, interesting, fascinating document, which it is. But it had a sort of interesting history. But the question is, how does this deep dive he makes into Whitman put him on his path? So that's the question. So 2 things about Whitman. One is, and I'll read you a little bit, and what gives me the title of my remarks today. There are all sorts of interesting references to translation, explicit references to translation in Song of Myself. But I'm going to read you a passage that I think is so revelatory. This is from section 24 of Song of Myself. Through me many long dumb voices, voices of the interminable generations of slaves, voices of prostitutes and of deformed persons, voices of the deceased and despairing, and of thieves and dwarves, voices of cycles of preparation and accretion. And then, skipping a few lines, through me, forbidden voices. Well, think about it. This is basically what Pavese is doing as a translator under fascism, translating authors from, mostly from American authors, but English authors in general. This is not allowed, okay? This is not allowed. This is a problem. So through me, forbidden voices, this interest always in, not only in the other, but the danger of engaging with the other. This is something that strikes me in Whitman's poem. The other thing, of course, is this very interesting schism regarding the I. So Whitman, before Pavese, will break this I narrative and refer to himself. He will refer to himself in the poem. So I quote, this is from section 25 of Song of Myself. It provokes me forever. It says sarcastically, Walt, you understand enough. Why don't you let it out then? So this I that becomes a you, okay, is, I think, well, it's a fascinating element of Whitman's poem, which is, you know, Song of Myself. One would think, oh, it's a song of himself, but of course we know it's not. In fact, it's absolutely throwing that idea of the self back at a totality, at sort of everything and everyone. And there's not time in the evening to get to the bottom of Whitman's poetics, but in a nutshell, he's playing with this idea, and we see it replicated in Pavese's diaries, which the diaries for me are a fundamental component of Pavese's creativity, absolutely that's sort of on par with everything else he wrote. In fact, perhaps I sometimes think of it as his masterpiece. And in the diaries, he does this all the time. He will refer to himself in the you. And so here on 22nd February 1946, this very severe entry, you have started spending your evenings alone again, sitting in a corner of the little cinema, smoking, savoring life at the end of the day, watching the film like a child for the adventure, the brief pleasure of beauty or an awakened memory. And you enjoy it immensely. It will be the same at 70 if you live that long. Now, knowing what we know of Pavese's life and his tragic end, it's very impactful. This is just one example of many places in the diary where Pavese he refuses the I. He refuses the first personal pronoun, and he goes into this you. And I think this is very much connected to his reading of Whitman. So that is my thought that I would like to share with you about Whitman. Moby Dick, meanwhile. So there's this incredible line in Moby Dick, well, among every other incredible line, but there's a particular line in Moby Dick toward the end of the first chapter, which is loomings, which Pavese very interestingly calls miraggi, which maybe I would ask him if I could why he made that choice. This is the sentence toward the end of that first chapter of the novel. I quote in English, "But as for me, I am tormented with an everlasting itch for things remote. I love to sail forbidden seas and land on barbarous coasts." So again, we have that word forbidden that we just heard in Whitman. Again, we have it in Melville. And Pavese translates it beautifully, I think. Quanto a me, io sono tormentato da una smania sempiterna per le cose lontane. Mi piace navigare mari proibiti e approdare su coste barbariche. Barbarism is also a word that is in Whitman's lexicon. He talks about the barbaric yop in Song of self, slang as a form of linguistic barbarism, deformation, this type of thing. Moby Dick is so many things. We've heard about it already a little bit. I would like to draw your attention, however, to its classical energy. Edward Said says in his beautiful introduction to Moby Dick that it is Euripidean in its outlines. That's something we can think about. It has, of course, an epic form, an epic sweep, and even Pavese, in his succinct but marvelous preface to Moby Dick, will talk about he says, ogni frase del libro ha quell'area inevitabile e fatale e che è come un suggello di classicità. So it's this constant underscoring of the classic sensibility in Moby Dick. Again, I will draw your attention to, of course, the famous first person that is driving the novel from its very first sentence, famous first sentence, which Pavese translates, chiamatemi Ishmael. And so we have that me, here I am, I'm telling you this story. But of course, the novel is going to go into so many different directions. And we are going to see things not only, it's not only Ishmael's story, it's the story of so many other people and things, but it's this experimentation that Melville has done in the novel that I think gives Pavese a way in to begin to explore and to challenge the idea of the first person throughout his work, throughout his fiction and his poetry. And of course, the diary is the great laboratory where he is working through the I. I think this is an essential way of understanding the work of Pavese, and I do think that these two authors who came to him in such a critical phase of his development as an artist can be looked at together. And maybe there are dissertations on this very topic somewhere out there, but it did come to me, and I wanted to share this with you. Also because Pavese is so steeped in the idea of discovery, right? Discovery, and which is very much at the heart of Melville and also Whitman. I will just end with, I thought it would be interesting to hear an English translation of Pavese. And so I will end with looking at I Mari del Sud, okay, his first poem he writes. And here we have, in this poem, I will argue, and I'm sure has been argued before me, we have the imprint of Whitman, and we have the imprint of Melville in this relatively brief poem. What's interesting about this text is that, so I have Le Poesie, this volume here, and it's the first poem in this book. I also have I Racconti, and it's in the volume of Racconti as well. So it's not clear how to read this very interesting hybrid text, because it seems like a poem, it is a poem, but it's also sort of a story. And what the story is essentially a conversation. It's a dialogue, it's a remembered conversation narrated in the first person. And here again, it's interesting because it's not a case of Pavese himself splitting off into a you, or creating a you out of himself so that he can have a dialogue with himself, as in the diaries. But here he's having a dialogue with a figure of a cousin, okay? So he starts off in the first person, but then the cousin subentra, right? He comes into the work and he begins speaking. And there's actual dialogue. there are passages in the poem that are referring explicitly to sea voyage. So we can think about Moby Dick naturally sort of, coming in, echoes of Moby Dick in the poem. And then, of course, with Whitman as well, this idea of the journey. If you remember the way the way that Song of Myself opens, I loaf and invite my soul. So this idea of loafing. So his poem starts out, they're walking along a hill. And so I found a very beautiful, I think, translation by the great translator William Arrowsmith from 1976. And I'm just going to read two passages from the poem. I don't want to take up too much time, but he calls it South Seas. And these are the two passages I'd like to share with you. The first has to do specifically with language, dialect, the issue of other languages embedded within language, the fact that language is not pure, the fact that language is always an unstable entity and is always being undermined. And so he's describing his cousin talking to him. This is the English translation. He said a lot, and he doesn't speak Italian, but the drawling local talk, a dialect like the rocks of this hill, so rugged and hard that 20 years of foreign idioms and sailing foreign seas haven't made a dent. And he climbs the path with that look of concentration I remember seeing as a child in the eyes of peasants just beginning to tire. So the cousin is someone who, like Melville, has made grand sea voyages, has had adventures, has been away a lot. He's been away so much people think he's dead, and then he actually comes back and they say, oh, well, wow, we thought we'd given up on you. And he comes back and to have this very intimate conversation with Pavese. So here he's really speaking about his cousin and his language, the language of this man who returns to his home, which is, of course, no longer his home. So this idea of sort of nostos, etc. So that's the first passage. And then I'll just share toward the end these beautiful lines. And he says, so this is the eye of the poem, so we can imagine Pavese. And I think of the strength this man has given me, wrestling it from the sea, from faraway countries, from silence, always silence. My cousin doesn't talk about the traveling he's done. All he says dryly is that he's been here or there and thinks about his motors. So I think when I read these lines and I think of the strength this man has given me, wrestling it from the sea, from his faraway countries, I think perhaps we can think about not substituting the cousin or adding in also writers like Melville, writers like Whitman, and the strength that Pavese is drawing at a very young age. After losing his mother, he's already lost his father, looking for direction as a human being, looking for direction as an artist, as a writer, as a thinker, as a translator, and the many other things. He contained multitudes, as we know. So I read into these lines the idea that these writers, Whitman, Melville, from faraway countries he never visited, are enabling him, do give him strength, do give him the strength to think about how to construct his journey as a writer. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jhumpa. This was an amazing, amazing presentation. Pavese, from wherever he is very happy that Jhumpa Lahiri, a great American and Italian writer, got him so profoundly in his understanding of two English language authors. I think nobody like Jhumpa could have done this miracle of bringing together Pavese the writer, Pavese the translator, and his relationship with American literature. Thank you so much. You did a fantastic, fantastic job. Thank you, Jhumpa. And of course, we owe a great debt of gratitude to Jhumpa every time I meet her publicly. I have to say, this is the greatest thing that happened to people who do my job to promote Italian culture in this country. And it happened that she fell in love with Italian literature and she wanted to be an Italian author and succeeded. But through her, the fulfilling of her dreams, she made all our jobs much easier to bring Italian authors, to make the voice of the Italian language heard in this country. Despite what the New York Times wrote on Friday, in an article that had nothing to do with anything, defined Italian language that is composed of a lot of vowels, gestures, and car honking. We have a few consonants, like in the Italian language, too, and several other things. Anyway, thank you so much to Jhumpa Lahiri, please. Grazie. And we are going towards the second phase of our evening, and it's the award ceremony, and we're going to listen to our speaker for the night. But before we go into that, we have a guest who is the president of the association that promotes tourism in the Langhe. The Langhe is the land of Pavese, and all those of you who read Pavese know what importance the landscape, the land has for him. So Mariano Rabino is with us tonight, and he's telling us something of what his organization is doing, along many other things, to promote also the cultural aspects of the Langhe. Preso, Mariano.
Good evening, everyone. Please let me say that I'm so glad to be with you today. Thanks for being here, and thanks to Casa Italiana Zerilli-marimò and to Fondazione Cesare Pavese for inviting us and share this moment with you. The Langhe Monferrato Roero Tourist Board is proud to be here today and be part of an event dedicated to an author from our land who wrote some of the most beautiful pages of all Italian literature and who translated from a language he loved so much. For Cesare Pavese, the English language, like America and its literature, represented strength, impetus, and the idea of freedom at a very difficult time for Italy and Europe. That is why we are here today, thanks to the ideal bridge that Cesare Pavese himself built between Italy and America. The Fondazione, with which we have always worked, represents one of our most serious, hard-working, and vibrant cultural realities. I'd like to take advantage of this moment and this important audience to tell you about the role of the Langhe Monferrato Roero Tourist Board and briefly explain our strategy and activities. We are a destination management organization that represents and manages a territory of more than 200 villages. Our aim is to promote the area of Langhe Monferrato Roero as a tourist destination and to support and coordinate the local tourist operators, trying to create a strong collaboration between public, institutional, and private stakeholders. In Langhe Monferrato Roero, food and wine are the main tourist products of our destination. Our hills, however, are first and foremost an outstanding cultural landscape of vineyards and woods, which shows the deep relationship between the local community and the natural environment. The landscape of Langhe, Roero, and Monferrato is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and the success of our area comes from simple and primordial things, such as nature, landscape and traditions, and we have the responsibility to preserve this heritage by raising the awareness among the local community while developing sustainable tourism practices. The locals are the first ambassador of our destination. They play a key role in promotion, and we really want them to be proud of the tourists we come to visit our land. At the same time, we firmly believe that the tourists are not just customers, but guests, and our primary goal is to provide them with a family atmosphere. We want them to feel at home. We'd like to and have to thank all our visitors because it is thanks to them that we are rediscovering our places, our cultural roots, and our traditions. They help us to understand the importance of our history and traditional values. We are working hard to diversify tourism products and develop slow and fair tourism. We really want to combine food and wine experiences with culture, art, and outdoor activities. Cesare Pavese said, "We do not remember days, we remember moments. If you come to our destination, you will experience unique emotions, ready to become wonderful memories." Thanks for your attention, have a nice evening, and we look forward to seeing you all in Langhe, Monferrato Roero.
Now I would like to welcome back to Casa Italiana the director of the Fondazione Cesare Pavese. He has been here before. We had a wonderful evening, and we built great memories also from that evening. And I would like to invite you to welcome Pierluigi Vaccaneo, please.
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank Casa Italiana Zerilli-marimò for hosting the final event of Pavese Festival and Pavese Prize 2023. I personally thank the director, Stefano Albertini, with whom we organized an event in New York in 2012, and who has been an important reference for Cesare Pavese and for the Fondazione Cesare Pavese in America ever since. Pavese has never been in America, and despite the fact that he always wanted to. As we discovered, thanks to our guest, American culture and literature characterized all this activity, both as a poet and as a writer. Pavese began his career as a self-taught translator of the great American storyteller of the early 20th century. This provided him the language, the style, and content that would be the basis of all his works. Recently, our foundation acquired the materials on which Yuri Muscardi carried out his research, and which brought us here in New York today to share this important discovery for a deeper understanding of Cesare Pavese's work as a translator. Fondazione Pavese is based in Santo Stefano Belbo, Cesare Pavese's hometown, since 2004. The foundation is an Italian and international point of reference for the dissemination of Pavese's work and cultural activity. Our activities range from organizing events to welcoming tourists from all over the world who want to visit Pavese places, from exhibition and museum activities to multimedia products such as documentaries, interviews, podcasts, and publication. They also include the custody of a rich heritage of manuscripts, documents, and books from 20th century Italian authors. The event of tonight is a part of Pavese Festival and the Prize 2023, the Foundation most important event which every year brings to Santo Stefano Belbo prominent guests from the Italian culture and musical scene to celebrate Cesare Pavese on his birthday, that is in September the 9th. This year, during the Pavese Festival, we inaugurated exhibition Pavese host Calvino, displaying along with the first edition of the two authors all the 21 books of American and British literature that the Molina family donated to the foundation and which are the subject of Yuri Muscardi research. Oreste Molina was the technical director of Einaudi publishing house, and therefore he worked closely with the editorial director, namely Cesare Pavese. A professional relationship and friendship between the two lasted throughout their lives. I interviewed Oreste Molina in 2007 with Andrei Carri, who is here with us tonight, for a documentary that would be part of the celebration for the centenary of the Cesare Pavese birth in 2008. In that interview, Molina told me that he had recorded the radio interview that Pavese did in 1950 for the Strega Prize. I was very excited about the news since Pavese's voice is unknown so far, and it would have been great to have the recording for such an important anniversary. So I asked Molina if he had kept it, and he told me that maybe it was in a box in their family garage, but it's not for sure. So at that time, Molina was already very old, and I did not have the courage to ask him to look for the tape with that interview. After that meeting, I lost contact with Molina and never had the chance to see him again. In 2022, by an absolutely fortuitous chance, I met Stefano Molina, Oreste's son. And I immediately told him about the interview with his father, who had died in meantime, and I told him about Pavese's voice and that his father had a tape with the recording of that voice. It was necessary, however, to look for it somewhere in his family house. A few months later, Stefano called me and told me that he had a few things for me. I immediately went to Turin, and Stefano told me that he had not found the interview, but a few books. And laid on his desk a huge, very huge shopping bag containing several books of American and British authors which were pinned down, commented on, underlined by Cesare Pavese. These books. I went back to Santo Stefano Belbo, scanned all the material and sent it to Iuri, whom I have known from more than 10 years now, and with whom we have worked a lot for the popularization of Pavese in the world. Yuri confirmed my feeling. We were delighting with a treasure that complemented the critical analysis of Pavese as a translator, showing how he worked with the translation of American and Italian language. The books donated to the foundation by the Molina family represent a real heritage for the study of Cesare Pavese, and the Yuri Muscardi research stands as a further an important piece in the path of knowledge and dissemination of Pavese cultural activity. These documents can be seen today in the foundation. Some are also now shown in my presentation and are available for all those who want to approach Cesare Pavese's work. But today is another special day for Fondazione Cesare Pavese, because the entire region of Alba, Langhe, Roero, today, September 27, we submitted our application to become the Italian capital of culture in 2026. Yeah, to the ministry. Fingers crossed. For the first time, 88 municipalities, led by the city of Alba, applied to become the Italian capital of culture. I am sure that New York will bring us good luck, and if we succeed, we will organize, Stefano, another meeting here in New York in 2026. But today is another special day because it's the day that we have the prize for Professor Salomone. And another important part of the edition of Pavese Festival is the Pavese Prize, which each year award 5 of the most prominent figures in the field of publishing, poetry, fiction, translation, and non-fiction. This year, Pavese Prize was held on Sunday, September the 10th, and among the awareness, we had Professor Rosemary Salamone, to whom we are today officially conferring the Pavese Prize 2023 for non-fiction. The prize consists of 2 things. The first is a special edition of the Cesare Pavese fountain pen with the signature of the author and made by Aurora for the centenary of his birth, accompanied by a white truffle from Alba, offered by, exactly, by the International White Truffle Fair of Alba. Our intent is, in fact, to create connection between the prize and the tradition and identity of our land, the Langhe. The pen represents the writer's work, which cannot be separated from the mythical landscape it originated from, the Langhe. One excellence of the region is the truffle, renowned all over the world. I have Cesare Pavese pen with me, but for the truffle, we need to wait a little longer. Being a product of the earth, the season has just begun. So we will send directly to Professor Salomone in New York when we find a truffle appropriate to the size of the professor work. So here is the pen, and after your speech, I can give you officially. And I want to read also a few lines from the motivation wrote by Claudio Marazzini, one of the members of the award jury. You will find the entire motivation on our website. The wonderful and extremely rich book by Rosemary Salamone, also for the final pages that seems to open spaces of hopes for new plurilinguistic perspectives, is a formidable tool, provoking read for those who underestimate the safeguard of the variety of languages worldwide in Europe. So, my compliments to Professor Salomone.
Good evening. I have been watching since every other speaker just leaped onto that platform and trying to think of how I was going to do it, but it worked without my falling. When I received the notice from Claudio Marazzini that I was a recipient of this award, I was truly bowled over. You know, this is an award that's given to Italians. I'm an Italian American, but not Italian born. And so Claudio indicated to me that I would have to give an acceptance speech. And I thought, okay, well, what joins me and my scholarship? And you understand, I'm a professor of constitutional law, but who writes on language rights. And so what joins me and my scholarship and the book, The Rise of English, to Cesare Pavese. And as I started thinking about how to form this speech, which I will now give, it was about language and belonging and identity. It was all about that. So here goes. As an American, obviously, it's, and I use that term in a broad sense because there are many, as I learned from writing the book, The Rise of English, that there are many Americas. It's indeed an honor for me to receive this award named after Cesare Pavese. It's especially so touching for me as an Italian, as an American of Italian ancestry, to be recognized by the country that my family left with very heavy hearts over a century ago. Through several generations, they came and went. They weren't quite sure where they belonged or where they wanted to stay. I have a great-great-grandmother who's buried in a cemetery in Brooklyn, and yet her daughter never came here, but her granddaughter did, and so they just kept coming and going over for I guess about half a century. But for the same reasons that Pavese became disheartened with Italy, during a dark period of its history, my family finally resolved that it was time to take root in the United States. It was also a dark time for the United States at that time because, excuse me, if you remember, there were very strict immigration quotas that were imposed in the 1920s and were not lifted until 1965. And so some of the motivation for those quotas was to keep out Italians. So this was a very dark period for America at that time. And like Pavese, who idealistically embraced what he saw as the soul of America through its literature, my family embraced the hope and opportunity that America represented while realistically accepting its failings, as Pavese later understood. Similar to many of their immigrant cohort, my grandparents insisted that their grandchildren speak only English, the ticket to being an American, which was the inspiration for my book, True American, which I dedicated to those grandparents. But they seemed pleased if we later studied standard Italian at school. So they were very uncomfortable with the Italian that they spoke and didn't want to hand it over to us. And just as Pavese's immersion in American culture helped shape his literary persona, the worldview and the many Italian traditions that my grandparents shared with me have helped define who I am and given me a keen interest in Italy, its culture, and its history. Like Pavese, who turned to America through its literature, I have repeatedly returned to Italy, searching for the missing piece in my own identity. Though my grandparents expected that their offspring would, quote unquote, do well in America, they never envisioned, nor did I, that one of their granddaughters would receive a literary award from Italy, and on the subject of English, no less, a challenging language, which, particularly for them, which unlike Pavese, who never lived in an Anglophone country, they never fully mastered despite decades of American life. Nor did they view America, their America, from the point of high culture as he did. That was left to those of us who followed, passionately seeking it through travel, the arts, and university study. Growing up in an environment where language was really a contested terrain initially led me to studying foreign languages and literature in college, then linguistics in graduate school, and then moving on to the study of law. My book, The Rise of English, for which I am gratefully receiving this award, allowed me to weave together that varied background in a very serendipitous way. The book opens with Dante Alighieri, the father of the Italian vernacular, who challenged Latin, the lingua franca of his day. As I note in the preface to the book, a visit to Ravenna in 2018 to engage with 100 cittadini, local citizens, reciting verses from Dante's Divina Commedia before his tomb, followed by a procession through the streets and a live performance of the Inferno. And I can tell you, going through hell is really quite gripping. Made especially palpable to me the enduring force of language in defining a community. That memorable experience helped me frame the scope and tone of the chapters of the book that followed. The book crosses the globe, and it really does. It really crosses the globe. But the Italian language plays a prominent role in it. The idea for the project, in fact, began with Italy in 2013, when the Italian news media were reporting on a controversy over English at Milan's Polytechnic Institute. The institute had decided to change all their graduate programs, all their master's and doctoral programs into English within 2 years. Upwards of 100 professors opposed the plan and took the institute to the Constitutional Court. And the court ultimately held that students have the right to learn and professors have the right to teach in the Italian language. Italian is important, the court noted, not just to transmit the country's heritage, but as a modern-day cultural asset in itself. At that same time, France was embroiled in a similar controversy over proposed legislation to offer universities some flexibility in teaching in languages other than French, i.e. English. For French intellectuals in particular, English was undermining the historic place of French as the language of culture and diplomacy, and threatening to create a uniformity of thought among scholars. Juxtaposing those two conflicts revealed distinct aspects of each country's history and politics that have shaped its attitudes toward a national language and culture. In France, the French language, carved into the Constitution, is inseparably tied to national identity. In Italy, it's very different. Language laws are negatively associated with fascism. The Constitution is silent on a national and even an official language. And late unification left a legacy of linguistic diversity uncommon in Europe. In a 2016 poll on language and national identity, and this was from the Pew Research Center, only 59% of Italian respondents responded that being able to speak the national language was, quote, very important to truly being Italian. That was the lowest of any of 10 countries in Europe. In France, it was 77% in terms of French. In the Netherlands, where there is very high bilingualism and high proficiency in English, it was the highest, it was 84%. In Italy, it was the lowest, at 59. As I dug deeper into these concerns raised in these debates over English taught programs, I realized that I had found the seeds for a book on English and the geopolitics of language. From there began an eye-opening journey of 7 years across 7 countries in 7 languages with a manuscript of 700 pages with numerous interviews of key actors. In addition to the Polytechnic litigation and the political and academic responses it generated over 6 years, the book covers the history of Italian and the role of the Accademia della Crusca in preserving the language. And on that note, I especially thank Professor Claudio Marazzini, the President Emeritus of the Accademia, for his generously endorsing the rise of English. The book also covers factors that have tempered the movement in Italy toward English, including the North-South divide, which we're all very familiar with, the endurance of regional, what they call dialects, which are really just other variations of languages, the country's slow beginning in teaching English throughout the education cycle as compared to Northern Europe in particular, and the practice of dubbing foreign, mainly American films, which has limited the ability of the Italian public to gain proficiency in English, in spoken English. The book raises significant issues now facing Italy, not the least of which are the tension between preserving the Italian language and the global economy. You know, how do you reconcile those two? The inequities between more and less privileged children in their exposure to, and I address this in the book, their exposure to English both in and outside of school, and the shortage of teachers sufficiently skilled to teach in English. In the current debate over the legal status of the Italian language, fears of losing Italian as a symbol of national identity underlie 2 but related separate proposals. They're separate, but they are related to each other. The first, imposing fines for failing to use the Italian language in certain public and private settings, has met broad condemnation across the country, including from the Accademia della Crusca. For many Italians, it again evokes images of fascism under Mussolini, who enforced very strict laws preserving the primacy of the Italian language, but of standard Italian. The second, declaring Italian as the quote-unquote official language, not the national, that would really, you know, those fears of fascism rise up when you say national language, but the official, even the official language in the Italian Constitution, which is common in other national constitutions, is more reasonable. Yet it could lead to unending litigation if strictly and widely enforced. It also could potentially cast a cloud over English-taught programs in the universities, and they are gaining widely in popularity. Not only do these programs raise international rankings and increase revenue for these universities, they further address larger economic and demographic problems, including an aging population, low birth rate, and a steady brain drain to Northern Europe where these programs are numerous and employment opportunities await those individuals who remain after graduation. In 2022, English-taught master's programs in Italy numbered over 700, up from 363 in 2019. Between 2022 and 23, Italy experienced over a 20% increase in interest as a study abroad destination for bachelor's and master's programs, the highest increase in Europe. And what is bringing this increase is this growth in English-taught programs. That said, as Italian universities respond to market demands for English among both international and domestic students, they should exercise caution and maintain the quality of education and continue to uphold the Italian language as a vehicle of knowledge production. One can only wonder what Cesare Pavese would say if confronted with these and other 21st century questions bearing on the English language. And these were questions that so deeply inspired his life and his work. How would the preeminent translator, sensitive to the nuances of translation, respond to ChatGPT and artificial intelligence? Would he enthusiastically or only reluctantly recognize new technologies for their modernity and openness? Or would he condemn them for lacking the human element and for their crass materialism, just as he turned away from American culture in his later years? Given how political strife in Italy profoundly affected Pavese's life and work, how would he consider today's political conflicts, nationally and internationally? What would he think of rising nationalism, massive migration, and globalization that are increasingly shaping national policies and institutional practices on language? What would he say of the culture wars now tearing the U.S.? What would he say on the attack on academic freedom in the U.S.? How might these interrelated forces have pushed his life and writing in unknown directions? Would we see his thoughts in filling the pages of The Atlantic or the New Yorker magazines? We can only speculate. On that current note, I circle back in thanking the Pavese Foundation for placing me in the pantheon of renowned Italian literary figures, a designation I accept with great humility. As an added bonus, it has given me the chance to revisit Pavese's life and work and reflect on how they relate to my own writing and identity as an American writer and author of Italian heritage. I am certain that my Italian grandparents are looking down and beaming with pride as my accepting this award closes the circle on their journey through language, culture, and belonging in the two countries that formed their past and became my present. It is especially fitting that I received the award in New York City, the gateway to upward mobility for them, for my grandparents, and for millions of others dreaming of the USA. Thank you. I guess you all can't see it. This is quite beautiful. And I don't want to be remiss. I'd like to thank Pierluigi from organizing my participation here from the other side of the pond, and for Yuri Muscardi for organizing it on this side of the pond. And thank you also to Stefano Albertini for hosting this event. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Rosemary. This was a great presentation, and I couldn't think of a better way to close this celebration of Cesare Pavese. This is not only fiction, it's the discourse about identity that is so compelling and so important nowadays. And we had the fortune, the grace to be blessed with these words by Rosemary Salamone. Congratulations again. And I thank you all for your participation, both those of us who are here and those of us who have been following us very faithfully. I get the numbers online. And I can only say, if the Langhe Monferrato win the nomination for Capitale Italiana della Cultura, we're going to bring them back for something else. Maybe some tartufo next time. For real. Thank you so much. Grazie a tutti.